Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of May 18th, 2021. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. This week, I'm happy to be joined by James Barragán. James is a politics reporter, recently arrived at the Texas Tribune. Prior to joining the Tribune, he worked as a State House reporter for the Dallas Morning News, among other beats, and has previously reported for the Austin American-Statesman and the hometown paper Los Angeles Times. James, thanks for being here. How are you settling in at the Tribune?
Thanks, Jim. I'm happy to be here, settling in well to the Texas Tribune. I came in at a weird time, so I'm just trying to get my feet set as we finish the session. And I'm excited to be here with you on the other side of the interviewing relationship.
James and I have talked many times over the years, and it's one of the many reasons I'm happy to have him here. So let's start with a little bit of color commentary before we get into the politics and politics nitty gritty. You've been on site at the Capitol this session. We were talking before we started. Give us a little sense of the mise en scene. Talk about the mood in the building in a very unusual session that started under unevenly applied pandemic conditions. Then hit by the blackouts after the winter storm. Talk a little bit about the feel in the building.
Yeah, it's definitely been a strange session. A lot less people, obviously, because of the pandemic. A lot less people willing to go to the building to testify and say their piece on a story, which I think has affected legislation. I think it has affected the outcome. You and I talked for a story that I was doing on this, but I mean, there's a certain part of the the political spectrum that's more likely to go to the Capitol, and one that isn't under concerns over COVID. So in that respects, in terms of public engagement, in terms of people coming into the building, there's certainly less people. There's certainly less resolutions, less fourth grade classes getting shout outs from the House or Senate floors. There's just less engagement with the public. I think in terms of how it's affected lawmakers, that's also different because they're much more free. You can see them. They're a lot more, open to being themselves and doing really what they want to do when people are not really watching. I think on the House floor, particularly, the House Speaker Dave Phelan has had a call order much more than last session because it is sort of like a frat house, not to offend frat houses, but I mean it's so loud in there because they're just being they're being themselves. They're they have the run of the mill there, and they're doing the things that they want to do without much oversight. Really, the press has been pretty restricted. Now they're allowed back on the House floor, but it has been a bit of a free-for-all.
You think that free-for-allness and that mood has also kind of fed into, the process itself, particularly in the House? I mean, I think it's probably, less so in the Senate, but you were talking about the House. I mean, the House has been,
sure.
The House has put out, a high volume of very conservative, legislation this time to kind of edge into the substance of this. It sounds like, I mean, you think those things are related?
Yeah, I think you do. There is something to that idea. I think it's a mixture of that, the sort of free-for-allness with not much oversight because the press hasn't been there and the public, frankly, hasn't been there. Something that happens all the time are those like public protests. Somebody unveils a sign or they have to be removed by DPS troopers. And that hasn't so much happened this session, which, who knows how much that actually affects, but at least people do know that, or the lawmakers know that people are watching, and so are a little bit more cognizant of that as they go about the sausage-making process. So I think there is something to it. The other thing that there is that we've got a new House Speaker, Dave Phelan, and he has applied a much more laissez-faire sort of approach to how he runs the House. He hasn't really gotten involved and said, "Here are my priorities." Even those low bill priorities, HB 1 through 20 or 1 through
Sure.
30, wherever they may be. In prior sessions, the speakers have said, "These are my priorities." He said that to some extent, but not really. And it's just kind of they're throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. And that is definitely the approach that we are seeing on the House floor. And it's also the approach we're seeing in committees. I know we're going to talk a little bit about elections, I think, but the way that elections committee has been run has certainly been, less than, I think, by the book. It's just kind of been surprise after surprise, roller coaster after roller coaster for people following that committee.
That's a pretty diplomatic way of putting that. I want to get to the election stuff. Just congratulations on that. I want to go back just to the mood of the House just for one more beat, and particularly the style of the speaker, and I'm wondering if you think that's. And you didn't say this, so I don't want to put words in your mouth. Put it this way: it strikes me that that's partially style, but it's also partially a new speaker trying to maintain his position to some extent. And I say that, hearing scuttlebutt that, there's a lot of sense I'm hearing in the House that things that sometimes look strange don't look quite as strange if you look at it kind of sideways from the perspective of the speaker trying to keep his coalition, the coalition that put him in the chair, together.
Yeah, sure. It's kind of hard to say because that's something that I've wrestled with all session too. I'm not sure who House Speaker Dave Phelan is or what he is like as a speaker, because I haven't really seen him particularly be forceful about anything. It is kind of a will of the House thing, which some people enjoy. Certainly conservative Republicans are definitely enjoying it right now. A lot of their priorities are getting kicked out. And so to your point, or to your question about whether this is about a speaker who is concerned about making sure he has a gavel next session, there might be something to that. I would say that given where we are at this point in the session, there's not a whole lot of fighting going on, and that's because they've passed a lot of those red meat items. So what is there left to fight about? So if you're a very socially conservative Republican, I think you're looking at the speaker and saying, well, he pushed through a lot of our stuff, and he wasn't particularly involved. He just kind of let the will of the House roll, and so that's led to that. But to your other question about new speaker, how has that been? I do think in the beginning you could see, even when he was talking at the dais, he was a little bit nervous. He wasn't fully used to it. I think now he's a lot more used to it. But I still, the same question for me. Who is Speaker Dave Phelan? What does he particularly stand for? I'm not sure. And before, there used to be in the House, there used to be that sort of more moderate approach under Joe Straus, even under Dennis Bond. And I think moderate Republicans would have said that, that was the chamber or the place in Texas government where they could see some of that moderation happening. Still very Republican policies, but not to the far right wing of the party. This session, it's gone pretty far right wing, and it's been in line, I think, in times with the governor, Greg Abbott, and with Lieutenant Governor Patrick, and even has outflanked Dan Patrick in some situations, like on permitless carry, which was something interesting to see. And so I'm not really sure, what his style is yet or who he is. I think that's still to be determined if he comes back for another session as speaker, and maybe we'll see him impose himself more. Right now, it certainly was like, let's let them run with it, and the House certainly ran with it. Republicans have a majority, and they have certainly gotten a lot of their priorities through that chamber.
Yeah, I think in fact, a lot of the thing, the way you were describing Bonin and certainly Straus, that was part of the complaints of the people on the farther right wing of the party that there is now making them a little more content is too strong a word, because I think part of the position is to not be satisfied, right. But I think that's an interesting read on that. I want to talk about elections, but since you mentioned guns, and let's knock that out while we're there. So, you mentioned, the maneuvering by Dade Phelan on guns. Talk about that a little bit. What did you see happening there?
I don't know that there was a whole lot of maneuvering. I think it was pretty straightforward. He's pushed for permitless carry before, so I don't think it was that much of a surprise. But I think even, senators, even some lawmakers and some activists who are, guns rights activists who advocate for permitless carry, at the beginning of the session, they were like, well, maybe this isn't the session for it. But it quickly became a thing where not only was Representative Schaefer's bill moving through, which is the one that eventually moved through and the one that they're negotiating right now, whether they're going to get a deal on, but Representative James White, who has also filed a permitless carry bill and has done so in the past, has made his position clear on that. But he was named as the chairman of the Public Safety Committee, which would deal with those issues. So I think that became pretty clear right away that was going to get a favorable hearing. And maybe behind the scenes there were more questions about what exactly that should look like. But multiple bills regarding that topic were moving. And so I think there wasn't a whole lot of maneuvering for Speaker Phelan on that. He was pretty straightforward about that. And to be fair, not to be fair, but just it's easy for him to do it, right? His district in Beaumont is a pretty conservative district. His voters, I think, are in favor of that. I don't want to speak for him or his voters, but I think
pretty likely
generally that's a district that's pretty conservative, right? Pretty conservative, and they are okay with that kind of thing. Where he maybe ran into some issues was on the other side, talking about El Paso and Midland, Odessa, and those West Texas shootings in 2019 that had a lot of traction in 2019 and have lost it. And so he had responsibilities, particularly to the El Paso delegation, who are his close allies, to try to get something done on those issues. And I think they have moved out the SB 162, the Lion Tri bill, and it remains to be seen whether the governor will sign that. But I think that's the only major gun control or gun violence bill that I've seen really move, other than Brooks Landgraf's statewide active shooter alert system, which is more a precaution. I think sort of guessing that there's not going to be a whole lot of
more literally a gun safety measure. I mean, when I said maneuvering, I guess I was picking up on something you said before, vis-a-vis the Senate, because it did seem to put Dan Patrick on the spot. And that felt to me like a maneuver. I think it certainly felt to Lieutenant Governor like it was a maneuver.
And I think that goes back to, so great point. So I think that goes back to, there's been this intra-fighting between the GOP, right? Going back to when Speaker Phelan was first chosen by the GOP caucus, or I guess he was chosen in a quote-unquote bipartisan way. But when he announced that he had the votes, Alan West, the GOP chairman, called him a traitor and said, this guy's not conservative enough. So I think, looking at this session, Dade Phelan, particularly with HB 1927, the permitless carry bill, he's saying basically he and his team is basically saying, you think we're not conservative enough? Well,
have a plate full of this, buddy.
And put the ball in Dan Patrick's court. And then Dan Patrick, he had to really maneuver and say, oh, here's where I am on permitless carry, because he had not really spoken on the issue. And I think his preference was to not have that conversation. But eventually, the political forces are going to impose themselves upon you. And so he was put in a tight spot. And that's basically where we are now, where the two chambers are sort of trying to figure out what that final bill is going to look like. But certainly, I think that shows the intra-party fighting in the GOP. And really, the House has put down its marker and really, I think, made good on Dennis Bonin's promise, the former speaker, that if you stay out of our way, if you let us choose more Republicans and more conservatives, then we're going to get these priorities done. Of course, as you pointed out earlier, those folks are never going to be satisfied, right? No matter how conservative your session is, you can always be more conservative. So that's a little bit of the trap that you fall in. But we've certainly seen those dynamics play out.
Well, and I think the measure of that, is, as Josh and I have written in some other places, the measure of that is in the Republican primaries. And I think that's where a lot of the emphasis is here. Along those lines then, so, you've written a lot about election security, election integrity, voter suppression, pick your label, or try to avoid all of them. If you can, although it's hard when you're actually writing. So let's talk about that. I mean, kind of what's your sense of what the arc of that has been this session?
Well, I just read a story in the Texas Monthly yesterday about how the Democrats did some backroom deals there with the
R.G.
House
Ratcliffe's piece. That was a well-reported piece. That was pretty nicely done.
Right, about how they tried to sort of soften the version of the bill that they got from the Senate. And so I think similarly to the permitless carry bill, they're going to try to hash it out in the back rooms and try to come up with something that works. Yeah. It certainly, I think, is going to be less strict than the original version. That seems to be the indication from the House. But they're sort of on on the gun bill, the House wants to be stricter, right? And on the elections bill, the House wants to be softer.
It makes for interesting bookends of those two issues that way, I think.
Definitely. So, but no doubt that issue on voting rights is a priority for the Republican Party, particularly for the right wing of the party, which, as you say, is the important piece for them in many ways, because that's how you win the primary. And in a lot of these districts, you win the primary and you've won the election. I think just outside of politics, if you look at just realistic terms and how much actual impact this will have on people, how much this is a necessity for the state, the reality is that this isn't really a necessity for the state. Election integrity, whatever you want to call it, voter fraud happens. I think that we in the press sometimes do a poor job of talking about it, and it makes us easy targets. But voter fraud happens, but it happens on such minuscule scales that it can't really affect big national races like the presidential race, which is what former President Donald Trump was claiming that it had affected. It affects local races. The big one that, Attorney General Paxton had was this little race in East Texas that I think total had like 2,000 votes. Yeah. And I think recently they found another one in Denton where a mayoral candidate was trying to stuff ballots into
grossly unsuccessfully, by the way.
The whole point is if you're being caught red-handed, and that's the whole, it just shows you how small scale and how difficult it is. So realistically, I don't think it would impact a whole lot of races here, but there's no doubt that it's a red meat political issue that a lot of the base, for one reason or another, I would say for nefarious reasons, is fired up about, and they've certainly dedicated a lot of time.
And when you say for nefarious reasons, you mean basically, you're referring to like the Trump influence?
Sure. Yeah. The Trump influence, the whole idea that, the previous presidential election was not decided, or the counting was off, which I don't think that there's evidence of that.
I was interested in the way that you kind of led in this discussion with, the point that sometimes in the press, you don't get the kind of, acknowledgement of the minuscule incidents, however they are, but that there is voter fraud.
Right.
I'm wondering like how hard do you find it to manage staying even-handed in this? I mean, we've talked about it a lot in the shop. Josh and I think talked about it on this podcast a couple of weeks ago that, I think it's difficult to maintain the point that, both Republicans and Democrats approach this issue from a mixture of principled and self-interested positions. And that doesn't make them equivalent for the kind of reasons you're talking about, that, the empirical argument for voter fraud is just not there at the national or, even in terms of outcomes at the state level. Yet, both sides have a dog in this fight and use different kind of ethical arguments to kind of promote their position. Right.
For me, it was interesting on the voter fraud stuff. I wrote a whole story about it, how it's difficult to even really have the discussion, right? Because one of the things about covering SB 7 in the Senate was anytime a Democrat would bring up, how often is this happening? Do we have any specific cases here in Texas? And Brian Hughes, the bill's author, would say, well, Senator, how much voter fraud is enough? Or how much voter fraud is enough? Basically saying like one case of voter fraud is one too many, which is the same argument that Ken Paxton has made. The reality is, sure, you can be such a purist about it that way, but we don't live in a perfect world. And even if there was an election of 100 people, I bet you one person would mess up and do it the wrong way, or there would be another person who tried to cheat or something. That's just the way, we live in a human world. It's not a perfect world, and there are going to be instances. But it's difficult to have an empirical conversation, an evidence-based conversation, when people zone in on just the small number of cases and say, well, and that's just the ones we know.
Right.
You open it up to paranoia. So it is very difficult. I've really tried on my end around that subject to point out, that there are these cases, and every time we cover them, we say, it's small, like this 2,000 vote race, and they're not going to be very likely to affect larger races like statewide or presidential races, just because the sheer number of votes, it wouldn't work. Like that would be a massive conspiracy that people would find because it would be very difficult to pull off. So we try to point that out. And I've also tried to point out sometimes where, to your point about the Democrats, they have reasons for doing the things that they want to do, right? They have reasons for wanting to have multiple mail ballot drop-off sites, which I think just empirically, I think is a good idea. You want to give people the opportunity to vote as easily as possible. But then there's other things like unsolicited mail ballots, which, to the point about voter fraud, can lead to problems if you're sending mail ballots to incorrect addresses. And so they want as many votes as possible, but there are issues that come with that kind of stuff, right? And I wrote a story about Harris County and how basically they poked the bear and are now dealing with the consequences. And I think there are some people in the Harris County elections department that are not my biggest fans, but nonetheless, I have to point it out. There are political consequences. All of it is politics. And so that's sort of how I deal with it. Just try to tell it from all sides and try to be fair and just be as clear as possible when I'm reporting.
I think it's interesting that the arguments have pivoted a bit on the Republican side. I mean, I think we are hearing a little bit less now about there's this widespread unreported voter fraud, and hearing more of what you were, two things that you were talking about. One, the idea that any fraud is intolerable. We have to have a kind of zero tolerance policy, which is kind of empirically an empty set.
Well, and the thing is too that it is kind of true. You got to give Republicans credit when they say this isn't part of a big national movement. We've been doing this, which is true. Right. Like Texas are the OGs at this. Like they've been doing this for several. I remember covering those bills. I remember covering SB 9 from Senator Hughes. So they do certainly have a point. I think the political reasons for doing it remain the same. And I don't know if we're going to talk about this, but like on the other hand, real things that we need like actual a lot of attention on, like the electricity grid and like the funding of public schools, those things have not gotten the attention this session.
Well, yeah, one of your competitors at the Statesman, Madeleine Mecklenburg, you might have heard of her, had tweeted earlier that State Affairs moved out SB 3 earlier today, the bill on the electricity infrastructure bill, right, essentially. So they're going to try, but what they wind up doing, I think, is an open question at this point.
Yeah, I think when consumers and ratepayers realize that they're getting stuck with the bill, there's not going to be any way to say, all Texans on ERCOT and the PUC, like that doesn't. Yeah, I mean,
as you know, we polled pretty extensively on that now. We did a poll with some colleagues at the UT Energy Institute in May, asked more questions in April. And as you get to the more sophisticated measures, the number of people that don't have an opinion on these things, because it's too complicated. I mean,
yep.
Look, if you were probably there for some of that, if you were watching those hearings the week after it all happened, it was pretty clear that part of what a bunch of the policymakers were trying to figure out was just, not to put too sharp a point on it, like what the hell was going on and how it all worked, because it's enormously complex. And I think in terms of, ratepayers paying, as soon as you start saying, yeah, well, we're going to securitize this, and then once we securitize it, well, you've lost much of the public.
Right.
Where you go, hey, there's going to be no more, no more foreigners on, no more out of state or non-U.S. citizens on the ERCOT board. 80% of Texans more or less think that's a great idea. That's going to help, right? So, yeah, no, I think and that raises an interesting question. And I was going to, if we had time, and I'm just going to take the time to do that. I mean, you talked about how we're not seeing, action, at least frontline action on the electricity thing. And I think they would say, look, we spent a lot of time on it. We're just not there yet, to give them some benefit of the doubt, or education, other things. And we did see a lot of action, in particular in education in 2018. So I'm wondering, because you've covered elections so much in the interim, I mean, do you kind of see this? And I hate this phrase, and if I can't believe I'm going to use it because I criticize my friends for using it. But is there kind of an elections have consequences piece here? But maybe a negative consequence in this sense?
Well, I don't think it's negative for Republicans and conservatives who are getting their priorities. And I think it's very, very positive for them. But certainly, I mean, the Republicans, ran their campaigns. They wanted to keep their majority. They wanted to have Texas be a business-friendly state. And it certainly has been a business-friendly state. And I think the other big thing that they ran on was like, we're not going to defund the police. And they certainly have stopped or are looking like they're going to stop that from happening. So I think they ran on those priorities. And elections do have consequences, and they have gotten those priorities so far. They've advanced them, and we'll see what happens in the next two sessions here. Anything can still happen, I guess.
Well, I don't think defunding the police is probably going to make a comeback. I mean, one might argue that they promised to do something that was not actually happening, but that's, perhaps.
But they've certainly been successful. And yes, the elections have had consequences, and they've certainly delivered on the things that they promised.
Yeah, I mean, I seem to remember you and I talking probably in early 2019 about, in a lot of ways there was kind of fear stalking the land because of the close call that some people had in the 2018 election. You fast forward to 2020, you get, pretty convincing effort by Republican candidates to hold the line. And all of a sudden, I think with some of the other variables that we've talked about, a new speaker, et cetera, but you're seeing a very different session in 2021 than you saw in 2019.
Yeah. And I think Democrats are kicking themselves for not going out and campaigning and, leading up to last November, because, the 2022 cycle doesn't look any better.
Yeah. I mean, I've got in a running argument with Scott Braddock about just how big a factor the non-campaigning thing was. And I think it was a factor. I also think, the worm turned in a way that I think Democrats didn't quite anticipate. And the campaigning piece certainly didn't help, although I think we still need to figure out a way to empirically kind of look at that. I want to ask you, a last kind of wild card question. Although, we've talked a lot about these issues. You've covered the legislature and state politics a lot. What do you wish you could convey to people that you can't quite get in print, or that you can't, that would explain something to people or tell a story to your readers about the way that the legislative politics work that you can't find a way to cover?
Well, I think overall it's more a political question, but I wish I could convey to readers and to people just how badly these guys try to duck news outlets, real local news outlets like the Texas Tribune, the Dallas Morning News, Austin American, the people that they really are beholden to, right? And they're only on like Fox News, or if you're a Democrat, you only want to be on MSNBC and those national ones, because quite frankly, not any, offense or shade to them, but they don't care about your property taxes. They don't care about the local issues, right, that we care about. And so we're very well versed in them. So they can throw out some cockamamie statement about property taxes or the border, and we're the people who know and can call them out on, that's actually not right or that's incorrect. The national outlets have a different idea. They have a different audience. They have different issues that they want to cover. We're the ones that know about the property tax and all that stuff, and they purposefully avoid us. And I think that is not a good way for democracy or a representative government to run. And I wish I could call them out more on that, because also I just think that's chicken. Like, I just think they should answer questions. So that's the one thing I would like to convey to. I wish I could convey more.
Do you think that's gotten worse in the time you've been a reporter? Have you been doing this? Not to make you say exactly how old you are, but you've been doing this for about how long?
I've been going 9 years professionally, I think. Yeah. So almost 10 years. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly gotten worse as more and more just new startup outlets have also come out that are questionable on whether they are actually objective journalism. And as talk radio and places like Fox News have gotten stronger and stronger, there's been less and less opportunity for traditional objective journalism to get those shots. So yeah, it's a troubling.
Okay, well, good. We'll leave it on that up note. James, thanks a lot for being here. I really appreciate you taking time. I know you're busy and you've got news to cover, so much appreciated. Thanks to you. Thanks to our audio staff at the Liberal Arts Development Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. As always, you can find this podcast and others' usual outlets and at the Texas Politics Project website at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Again, many thanks, James, and thanks to our listeners, and we'll talk to you next week. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.